let's get started. So, your quiz 1 is due. Some of you have already submitted it. I've given you, I'll send you a note that says thanks for your contribution. Most people are. That's usually an indication that I've gotten it. And your grades are actually up on Canvas. So look there, and people got full credit. And it's just a matter of turning. And I received your full request. So, as I said, there's no penalty for being late. So if people are late, it's okay. But remember, next week we have another assignment, reflection due, and that or reflection 2, and that is due and 1 week after that. So be keeping along with our assignments. You don't want to fall behind because you have to do. So that's what we've got. So let me show you actually where we are with the repository. And I promised you that I would show you what this looks like. So this is the repository. This is the main repository. So when you were working on your assignment, you had your account name here / project manager. And then you issued a pull request, which then transferred that work to Orwell group / project manager. That's what the pull request. It's just moving all the files over. And I accepted it, or I think some of you accepted your own. So I gave you permissions, which is fine, as long as I know that it's in there. And I keep checking, making sure that I have everything working. But if you were a maintainer of a repository, you would have people submitting their work into the repository, and it would show up under the pull requests. Actually, I have 2 open pull requests now we need to take care of. But you would look under that pull request tab. So let's do that actually right now. See if it's there. And we have a few people who have submitted their work. Okay, good. And so then I'll go through those. I'll accept those, and then they'll end up being merged. And then once they get merged, they'll be in here now. So this is the main repository with our updated files. So if you go into quiz 1, remember everything is the same as it was before, except for these things that have been added to quiz 1. So if we go under quiz 1, we have everyone's, or the people turn their work in. Markdown file. They have the document with 3 elements. We have a name file, which is here. The name file is, so we see a bunch of names here, okay? And like I said, it's going to be, I'll probably do a little bit of editing on that, that's fine. Just because sometimes it gets, like we had some problems with merging, that's fine. But that's what we have. So all that work has been merged in here. And as a maintainer, I'll have to clean this up a little bit because, sometimes you do get some spacing issues and things, and that's fine. If you're managing a large project, you'll have to do that from time to time. Sometimes things, you can't merge things without changing a file. I had that problem last class, at the end of last class, and then asked me about that when we went through it just pulls up the document, and you have to sort of get rid of the characters, so it shows you. So it's actually helpful in that respect, the automation in GitHub. And so that's what you have. And as a maintainer, you would do this for any shared repository. You would have you'd be the go-to person in a team to make sure all of this stuff gets coordinated and that nothing gets overwritten. And for the most part, you can do that. And what would help here, and I didn't do this, I didn't enforce this during this assignment, what tends to help maintainers, in other words, people who accept pull requests in a repository, is they have a set of community standards. You had some instructions and README, but sometimes if you're doing a lot of merging of code, you need community standards, like you might want to have a standard for annotating the code so that everyone can contribute a block of code. It's not only the block of code and it's in the right place at the right line number, but it's also has a comment that tells you what it is. And if you've taken 205, what commenting is code. You also know that line numbers matter when you're putting code. So that's good. We can have some community standards. We might also have uh, a formatting guide or something like that. And of course, the maintainer is usually someone who is given that role by the community, or maybe they're given that role by the project manager. That's a specific person who does this sort of task. They make sure that everything is organized, everything's formatted, and if there are problems with the automation, that it is. Usually, we don't want to leave it up to the contributor to do that, although sometimes it's inevitable. But that's how a project might use GitHub. So you've gotten your first taste of issuing a pull request, seeing what happens when a bunch of people do this to the same repository. So that's what we get this kind of a collaborative set of documents. Okay. And then, of course, we have, if we go back to some of these documents, I like them. I was looking through them. You have different, like this one where you have like a little box or a little tic-tac-toe table and then a picture and and text, bold text and regular text, italicized text, etc. So we just need those three elements, and I think everyone has them in their documents. So if I go through some of these documents, I can see some of these elements here in the documents. Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't want you to spend a huge amount of time on this, just to get a taste of how to write something markdown and how to push that with the asset, some link to the asset, which is like a picture or whatever. And you could host that in this repository or somewhere. So I think everyone got the hang of it, basically. So congratulations, participating in your first open collaboration. Maybe you've done this before, but in this class. So we are at our second lecture in Unit 2. And I promised you that I would go over some of the slides from last time that I skipped over, because I think it fits in better here. So last time we were talking about sort of community building, and sort of scoping the project. It kind of went in different directions. We talked about the history of project management, which I think is important to understand where we are now. But then we started talking about the scope of a project, and sometimes also the scope of a community that operates on the same principle. And so, when we think about the scope of a project, we don't want to include everything in our project. We have our vision statements, and I've stressed that, I want you to be sort of efficient with those. I want you to sort of give a small, I wanted you to give a small paragraph, what the project is, what it might be good for, et cetera, why it's interesting. But then I said, at some point over the course of the class, you're going to refine it. As you kind of think more about it, you're going to refine it a bit. So that's basically what we call rescoping, which is like changing the scope. And it's much easier to change that vision statement, to rescope that vision statement, than it is to rescope an entire project. And in my graduate course yesterday, we talked about rescoping a project where maybe you're like halfway through the project and you figure out suddenly you can't accomplish what you want. So you have to spend a lot of time and energy and burn through a lot of social capital state in changing the scope of the project. So you want to avoid that. So how do you really avoid it? Well, you want to be proactive. You want to make sure that vision statement is tweaked. You want to make sure that, sort of the design of your community, the design of your project is tweaked. You want to make sure that your team is working well. But you also want to think about things that you need to do. And this is where we try to prioritize these things. So we don't bite off too much. When we don't bite off too much, we can do what we need to do. We don't try to do everything and be everything ever. So this is from the Ben Cotton book, Project Management for Open Source Projects. Again, that's on the syllabus. And he advocates for a couple of approaches. So the first one is the Eisenhower matrix. And this was General Eisenhower II. He was making very important decisions. And he would wake up and make decisions, and they would have to have good way to sort of a good heuristic to make these decisions quickly. Because you could like agonize over a very tough decision all day. That doesn't help you. So he had this method where he basically created a binary decision matrix. So everything a decision had to be made on, there were two sort of columns. And one column was urgent, one was not urgent. You can imagine if you're in the middle of fighting a war, there are certain things that are extremely urgent, some things that are not urgent, but maybe necessary. And so this is just a very quick way to like make those decisions. Put them in two categories. And then, you have like a good idea of what to do first, what to do later, or what to do now. And certainly if you're really kind of run a compressed timetable in a project, if you're trying to trim something up a week, if there's something absolutely like if you have like a huge bug in your software or a huge problem with, there are all sorts of problems in information technology where you have like a system goes down or, there's some virus that you have to respond to. It's very important that you get certain things done now if people are relying on this. What was this? The CrowdStrike thing. That was important. That you can think that's an extremely urgent thing that needs to be solved now. We care about we care about just kind of patching that and like dealing with the rest of the stuff later. So that's where this comes in handy, that sort of situation. Then there's the Moscow prioritization. And Moscow is one of these acronyms that they just kind of piece together. So you kind of make them. But it's basically M, S, C, and W, the important letters. And this is a prioritization method where you take this binary decision matrix and you say, okay, maybe there's some things that are urgent, maybe not urgent, but we're not really on that timetable. We're on a wider timetable. So, we might say have things that have to be included in our project. Okay, we're not making, it's not necessarily stuff that needs to be done today, but it's stuff that maybe needs to be done in this development. Like we're going to have each month we're going to have a development cycle. We want to do something this month, but we don't want to do things later. And maybe there are things we don't want to necessarily do at all. But we want to have a method for kind of hashing this out. What goes in what bucket. So the first this decision matrix now has 4 columns, and each column, of course, is going to give you some guidance as to when, how important is this. So the first column is must-have. So if I'm designing a piece of software, and we have to kind of schedule out the priority for different things, different features. The first set will be must-have. So everything, when we think about our project, we might think about what our competitors, what it is that we're doing that is, what are the standards people expect. Everything must have. So, maybe our program must have a user. Okay. Must have that. Maybe it must have scales. Well, maybe. So we leave that aside. We also maybe have a must have for certain types of accessibility. It's just depending on your priorities or what your project is in turn. So you go through the must-haves and you decide what's a must-have. And there's a temptation to say everything must be in here. You just say everything must happen. But that's not what you want to do. You want to resist that. You want to have, you want to start maybe with a binary matrix. You say we must have these things. We must, we can leave these other things aside. And then we have our must-haves. And we have to kind of be judicious about what those must-haves are. They have to be sort of critical things. And that's because in our second category is going to be everything else. Then we take that second category and we do another round of categorization. This time we take that, catchphrase and category. We ask, should this project have this thing? Should this product have this thing, this feature? Or can we just leave it aside? And so you kind of have the standard where you go, from the most urgent to maybe pretty important. And then we do the same thing for could have, which is It could have it, we don't know. We'll leave that aside. If we have time, maybe we'll tackle that problem, but if not, then it's probably not that big of a deal. And then we have a category won't. So we're trying to work from like the most urgent thing down to won't have. And so won't have is definitely stuff that's a problem. By the time you go through this process, you should have haves, you should have could haves, should have haves, you should have must haves. So you prioritized all the things that you want in your product, sometimes in your community, by kind of having that sort of tools. And so that's just one method. You can think of your own method for it. It still doesn't solve the problem of how do I really prioritize, because you can, you know, sort of have a threshold for what's must have. It's very low, right? Everything, you must have everything. Your product must have all the bells and whistles, your community must serve everyone. But that's not really the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to sort of have some standards for each of these, maybe some very explicit standards, and then look at what you have and, you know, really be critical as to what category they belong. And sometimes it's a tough call, and it usually depends on how many resources you have. So again, if you have very little time to turn something around, you may only have a few must-haves, and that's, you know, and that's what you have because you can't do everything, and it really does focus the mind as critical. If you have like 2 years, which you usually don't, but if you do, then maybe must have and should have nominate the list. But again, you need to find a good criterion based on, you know, what you're doing, be realistic, and then what's your resources. So, you know, in thinking about the scope of your project, you know, and you think about these to-do issues, once you categorize them, you know, you got to kind of think about how to address some of these issues, and there are certain trade-offs. Okay, so the first one is usability capability. So, you know, usually we think of to-dos as doing something, and then creating a set of to-do issues. And when we think about some of these things that we want to do, usability and capability, you know, usually those are things that we want to add on. We want to think about the to-do thing as like a set of things, say in a product or something like that. So we actually, you know, maybe expand our issues to include some and more explicitly. There's a principle called differentiation and catch-up, which is where, you know, you take your to-do issues one at a time and you drill down on what issue before starting the next issue. So if you have a list of like 3 or 4 must-have things, you take each one of those things and you sort of differentiate what that is. So if you say I need to have a user interface in the product, then you know, maybe I want to drill down. What does that mean? What kinds of features we want in the user? So we really kind of work that out. And then once you have that worked out, then you can address, at least set those to-do issues up before you move on to the next must-have, which might be something like, you know, security patches or something like that. And then you would drill down on that in the next issue, and so on and so forth. Then there's, of course, expanding your community or growth for new collaborators, basically expanding your resources. So if you have only 3 people on your team, you might not be, you know, you might have only a few must-haves, and really, you know, in that case, it might impact the quality of your project, where you can't really do a lot of things because you don't have a lot of people to work on. If you expand your community and you solicit new collaborators, and that's successful, you can actually maybe have more must-haves, should-haves, and you can expand your project. Likewise, and expand what you're doing, given the amount of time you have, and you can have a better quality product or project. Expanding, yeah, and then reward long-suffering issues. So a lot of times people will take these to-do issues and they'll review them on a regular basis. So, you know, we want to categorize them, but then we also want to reevaluate them. So we want to say, you know, we had maybe, you know, at the beginning we kind of were generous and we said we must have 10 things. And we clearly didn't have the time, we don't clearly don't have the time to incorporate 10 things. And, especially since we've done some of these other things, expanded the number of staff issues, because we said we need an interface and expand the number of interface issues. So now we have like 40 issues. Well, that's too many things. And you want to review and see if you can reduce that or categorize those. But, sometimes when you're reviewing those, there's a temptation to always start working on a new thing or working on it. So you kind of, sometimes you skip over things that are unappealing or hard. So like, you think about like when you go home after a long day, last thing you want to do is empty the trash. It has to be done. And so if everyone has that attitude, the trash never gets empty. This happens in projects where you have these issues that you proliferate a bunch of issues, or you're continually creating new issues, and they look very, very appealing to people. As so they say, well, I want to do that first, and I want to keep doing the most appealing ones first. What you would do is you end up, working on some issues and solving them, getting a part of the project done. But then you end up with all these ignored issues that are not very, they're very, non-glamorous or unglamorous, and they get ignored. And so you can't, sometimes they're important things, but they're just kind of these unglamorous things. And so, you have to have a strategy for making sure that everyone takes up trash. So some people adopt a strategy of rewarding long-suffering issues or perpetually ignored issues by prioritizing them before we go to the next step. So, we might have a bunch of must-have and should-have issues, sorting and prioritizing, categorizing this way. But before we categorize another round of issues that are must-have or should-have, we automatically take the things sitting around for make them must-have issues, must-do issues. So it's like, that's a way of getting through the backlog of things to do, is by just saying those are must-have things, no matter what they are. So you can use these kind of strategies where you rank your tasks, you organize them, you perpetually review them, and then you kind of use different strategies to address them. And, eventually you get to having, you can get through a lot of the to-do issues. We talked last time about how to get started. This is kind of how to move forward and getting started. And so when we think about scope, I have, this is from Adrian Watt's book, Project Management. This is also in the syllabus. This is actually just thinking about scope and its definition. So when I say project scope, and sometimes even community scope, I mean a couple of things. So scope is defined in terms of size. So usually it's like the size of your project and the length of your project or the length of people's involvement. And so there are a lot of things you have to think about when you think about scope. First of all, it's like, what do you want to do? So if you want to do everything, or if you want to do a very general thing, projects that are general, then your scope is necessary. It just is. Sometimes if you have like an open source community or a community, you might integrate that with the organization. You might have a community outside of the organization that they work together. That can be, that can sort of mitigate your scope in different ways. So if you're just planning a community outside the organization, scope of that community is limited. If your community is the organization, in some cases, in open source that's the case, then your scope is going to be larger. So, it's really what you want to do. What do you want to do? How do you want to configure your organization? What is your vision? How big is it? How small is it? Another thing that defines scope is what do you want to create or achieve? So again, you want to make something that is of high quality, it's going to dominate the market. The scope is a lot larger than something that's highly specialized or a first pass approximation. There are different ways to view that. Also, the community contributes something. If the community is contributing a lot, then the scope is going to be larger. have a lot of people sort of collaborate, which you wouldn't have in your internal organization. And then finally, what kinds of resources are. So this acts as a constraint on us. So if you have very little money or if you have very little reach, people just aren't interested in a project, or it's maybe something that 20 people in the world are interested in, or you have very little money to invest in, sort of getting the word out and building a team, then your scope has to be smaller because your team of potential whatever. So all these things sort of define scope of your problem, scope of your project, and so forth. Okay. So we're going to return to this idea of open source community. And I've kind of been weaving around here in this last part. I've kind of talked about scope, talked about prioritizing issues, things like that. And that's because to have some sort of community, to have an open source community, to have a community focused on your project, you must first build an open project or just a project. It could be closed, then community. So you don't want to just start your community from scratch. Sometimes, we talked about communities of practice. Sometimes projects grow out of this. Well, really what happens there is that, you build a project maybe from people, like-minded people doing something. They build a project, and then people from that community, join that project. But the project itself has to have a scope. It has to prioritize things. Otherwise, people won't necessarily join it. There are plenty of projects that are very focused on a certain community that grow out of community efforts to do things, but aren't successful. And that's because they don't think of the project design first and then recruit people. So the community, they think about, maybe this is a self-evident thing to our community. We don't need to worry about making the project, focused and constrained and work as a culture. So that's kind of that state. Okay, so this is the figure that I kind of promised you earlier. So, when you're in a project, you might decide to have communities. And, we have like communities around projects where, we recruit people to be ambassadors to the project, or we recruit people to be open source contributors to the project, or, we just want people to be, we want to engage users that use our product, that, are part of the community. So, when we have a project, we have this community, and whether it's intentional or not, so this is the project. And usually a project has 4 contributors. So if I set up a project, we usually have a couple of people working on the technical details and planning. We have some maintainers, like we had with our repository, who might, accept pull requests, people who are sort of in charge of the efforts, organizing things at sort of the granular level. And that project, of course, can have a community that they recruit, or they have a community that they can, that sort of coalesces around the project. So if there are people who are like, maybe contributing money, they're like a Kickstarter, they might be in this open source community. If you have people who are forking a repository, that's part of the open source community. If you have people who are you're making tutorials for, you want to teach them how to use the software, that's part of your open source community or your community. So there's this community adjacent to the core project. But then, of course, there's a larger community outside, and that's like the rest of them. And so the open source community just doesn't come out of it. Sometimes it's, you have an open source community around your project that comes from the sort of these communities of practice where, these people kind of are automatically interested in your project. But, oh, this is what I do. And there are not a lot of people in the world that do what we do. And I want to be a part of this project. But still, then you have people who might be interested in that, who might be in that community of practice, who don't necessarily gravitate towards it, or whatever. Or you just might have a larger community of people who don't care or don't know about your project. And so one of the things you want to do is you want to be able to sort of, have this sort of interaction with the open source community, but you also want to have an interaction for the community outside of that immediate. And what I mean by that is, like, if you have a project and people are interested in your project and you maybe make tutorials, you might have a community of learners who want to learn about how to use that project. They might want to learn how to do certain things with a piece of software. They might want to learn how to interact with your organization and so forth. And so, or they might want to be involved in your organization at some level. So that's where your open source community is. And you try to engage these people and you try to feed this group of people, with information, with, try to encourage them to interact with the project. They're not core contributors. Maybe they're not paid. Maybe they're not in that core of people who sit in meetings daily and work on issues, but they're there. But you have this larger community you want to engage as well. And sometimes there are a lot of people out there who may be unaware of your project that you can make aware. Or, there may be people outside of your community of practice that might actually find your project very useful. I showed you that community of practice chart where, they kind of classify different projects into different bins because that's kind of what the product does. Like Zoom is for meeting spaces or something. Of course, people might use Zoom for something else we don't know about. And they might be very interested in your project, but they don't know about it. Or someone maybe kind of comes up with a hack that allows them to use it. So all of a sudden you get these people interested in your project and they come into your open source community. And so it's very much, important. It's very important when you're growing a community of your project to engage with this open source community and to reach out to this larger. Sometimes your project is embedded in a community of stakeholders, or your community is embedded, your project's embedded in a community, and there's stakeholders in that community who need to be consulted. And so those stakeholders are kind of in this ring, and then the other people are out here. And so they actually will communicate with those people, but they represent a larger community. So that's a relationship you have with sort of between your project and the rest of the world. Even, if you don't want to think of it as an open source community, you can maybe think about it as stakeholders. You can think about it as people with immediate interest in your project versus people who are more of a casual interest in it, or maybe impacted by it, whatever. But I like to think of it this way because it helps you to think about how your project is affecting other people, and how when you have a group of users, say, you can expand that group of users, a group of contributors, and it can also contract if you don't pay enough attention. People can leave the open source community and become disinterested. And you want to be able to do research to figure out why, how your project has appeal, what you can do to sort of maintain that appeal. There's a lot of ways you can, sort of. Now we return to scope, and I want to mention a couple more things about scope and about planning a project and optimizing how you use your schedule, your financial resources, and define the scope of your project. So if we go back to the Adrienne Watt book, Project Management, she introduces this model of triadic constraints. So this model of triadic constraints basically argues that you're optimizing for something based on three factors that maybe you can control, maybe you can't. So what you're doing in this model is you're optimizing. So your project usually has a product or an outcome, and that outcome or product is going to have a certain level. And sometimes the quality is very, sometimes it has to be perfect. Or if you're doing mass production, you don't want to have too much waste. Or maybe you don't want to have very many bugs when you make a release. Sometimes it doesn't necessarily matter. You can fix things afterwards. But the point is that there's some standard of quality to achieve. But to achieve that level of quality, you have to think about the constraints of it. So it just doesn't happen that you achieve a level of quality, say through community standards or through sort of exacting planning, planning out all these issues that are perfect and, attacking them in a way and prioritizing them in a perfect way. It's actually more about looking at the resources. So indeed, scope is important. Defining the scope of your project. So if you have a scope that's too far field, if you want to be all things to all people, it probably will negatively impact your quality. So you want to have the right scope. Well, but in having the right scope, that's also affected by your financial resources or the cost of doing the project and the schedule. So, if your schedule is like a week, like I said, a week or a month, you can't really have a very wide scope. If you have a very short schedule and a very large scope, that will necessarily mean that your quality is going just low. I mean, it's very hard to have something of high quality in a very compressed timeline with a very large scope. Because you can't address every issue that you need to address in that time. If your schedule is a bit longer, say it's like 6 months, and your scope is, small, relatively small, you can have a high level of quality. But then if your financial resources are extreme, if your costs are high, sometimes, some projects, they require certain, costs. Like if you want to do something with machine learning, sometimes you have to, get cloud credits by, computational, and that can be very expensive. Sometimes you don't know ahead of time how expensive that's going to be. And so if you don't, if your scope is very large, say you pick a project where you just need tons of training data, and you need to run the model for, days or weeks even, then your cost is going to be pretty high, regardless of your schedule. So that means that if you don't have the money, your quality is going to, because you can't do the training of the model you need to, and so it becomes hard to have the quality you desire. So these three things conspire to sort of control the quality of your project. And it also, this works with communities too. So if you want to have a healthy community of high quality where people are contributing, you need to have a good scope of that community, who's involved in the community, what they're doing. You need to have resources for that community. And, you don't necessarily need to invest a lot to have a community, but you need to make sure that whatever financial resources are required for that community to do outreach or to, give people the resources they need or for training, that those resources are there. And then schedule. So you need to have, give people enough time to do things. You need to have enough bandwidth to manage these things and so forth. So this model is pretty diverse or versatile. You can use it for both community building and for managing project quality. Now, Ben Cotton, in Project Management for Open Source Projects, he proposes a slightly different model. This is basically the same set of constraints, scope, cost, and schedule, but also now quality is a constraint. And it's a constraint on the sort of geometric representation here of project resources. So the way he kind of thinks about this is if you look at, each of these constraints are at a corner of this polygon. And for each corner, they get shrunken in or they get pulled out depending on how severe that constraint is. So if your cost is high, this part of the polygon will come out like this. If the quality needs to be high, this part of the polygon will come out like this. And so, you can make this polygon sort of very large or very small, depending on, how your project matches. And so this gives you sort of an intuitive idea of, kind of the shape of your constraints or the shape of your project resources and their effect. So, but it's the same principle. If the quality is high, or if you demand high quality, you better also have a lot of money. You better have a very tight scope. You better have a lot of time. And that will show up in this sort of model. Otherwise, this polygon will be skewed. And I guess you could probably have a library of really successful projects and their shapes, and then compare it to your project, which may be of a different shape. And that would be like the alarming thing to see. But anyways, this is the idea that these sort of constraints pull on each other and they affect. Okay. So we talked about scope, what you want to do, what do you want to create or achieve, what kinds of resources are available. And we also have different types of time limitations. So we talked about time being important, schedule, and of course, time is very important to think about both abstractly and create projects. Any communities. So, we have different types of projects. We have time limited projects. So, sometimes projects start at a certain date and end at a certain date. So like when I say you have a month to do this project, that means it's usually some sort of time limited project. Start today, the end of the month. And then if we don't get things done in a month, then that's what we don't do in our project. Whatever we do in the month's time we do in our project. And a lot of times in companies, they'll have these time limited projects where you do something over the course of a year or a month. A lot of internships are like that, summer to do things. That's the time you have. So you have to think in terms of that time limited nature. Sometimes when you're kind of planning out what to do in your project, prioritizing things in the project. Sometimes, in a lot of open projects where you have distributed collaboration, you have to state work periods. I think I covered this in one set of slides where I talked about like assembling different teams over different periods of the year. So, for a 3-month period, we have one team working on something, and then another 3-month period, another team working on something. And so having that assemblage of talent for that period of time, really requires you to think about what kinds of issues can you solve in that period of time. So if you need to do some, statistical analysis, and your statistical team is there like in the fall or in the summer, then you have to kind of move those issues to the summer, prioritize and such, and plan on that being the time that you do. Sometimes, projects are open-ended, so you can have a time-limited project, but whatever you don't get done, you might just kind of do whatever you can in 3 months, and at the end of 3 months, do sort of post-mortem on the project and say, what can we bring forward from the project that's important? And then kick off another project where you work for 3 months on those important things that you found, interesting things that you found in your first project, and continually do that to move the project. Now, the reason I bring up a lot of these different types of distinct work periods and open-ended types of projects is because in open source communities, that's often what you'll have. You won't have the sort of disciplined day-to-day workflow that you would have in, say, like a core team, or a team in a formal environment like a company or an LLC or whatever. You have these sort of you have these very flexible work periods, and you have people who are available only at certain times of the year. So you have to fit that all into your project. You want to leverage the community, especially in terms of development. This is something that you can, you have to think outside the box in terms of time and being time limited. Sometimes projects, however, are completed at an objective. So sometimes you work on a project and you say, and then sometimes they do this in companies, sometimes they do this in scientific labs where they do like a project and you'll work on it for a while and there's no time limit except to reach some sort of conclusion about whether you failed or whether you were successful. So a lot of times if you're, if you're working in like, food preservation, or if you're working in something like testing different types of paint, you might be involved in a project that tests these different types of paint on surfaces, and you might give a report, say which ones were good at sticking to the surface, which ones were bad, and that's your project. And then you take the successful examples and you move forward with another. Sometimes in communities, people do this where they try out different ideas, sort of mini projects. Say people in the community might suggest a project that they work on, and then a good way to kind of manage that expectation is to say, okay, if you want to work on this project, you can do sort of like a mini project where you kind of either are successful in implementing something big. So people might want to add a feature to your open source software. And he said, well, before we commit to this, we want you to work on this project. We want you to code it up and see if it works. And if this sort of prototype works, then we can pursue putting this feature in software. And so you have the sort of completed objective time limitation. And of course, because people aren't going to work on it maybe forever, they only have like 2 hours a month to put into it. But you really don't want them to do that because people tend to not get it done. So you want to have people kind of on a schedule where they can have this sort of idea that if they complete this thing when they reach an objective, that it's worth their time. So it usually helps people manage their time, manage their resources. And so, there are many more constraints over time. If we think about this model of constraints over time, we have the 4 constraints. This is from the Ben Cotton model. And, when I showed you those constraints, they were sort of at a single point in time when you think about your scope, your cost, your schedule, your quality. But indeed, over time, these things change. They can change quite drastically. So, you might have, for example, your schedule might be very open in certain parts of the year and then be very constrained in other parts. You might have in an open source community, you might have very few participants over the wintertime or summertime. So we can think about these constraints changing drastically over time. And in the Van Cotton model, he proposed that this polygon shape sort of tells you something about how constrained you are as a project. Well, that polygon is going to change over time. And so you can actually look at sort of the dynamics of your project in terms of, okay, over the summer, we are really schedule constrained. We might also be cost constrained. We might have funding in the summer. So we need to change our scope over that limited time, which means that you only do certain things over that time. And we expect a certain level of quality. So to match our constraints, we want to maintain our level of quality. We have to make changes to our project seasonally or sometimes permanently if we, like, say, lose people from our development team or our community shrinks down or lose people who are very important to driving the project. So these are all things that you can be proactive about, but sometimes you. So thinking more about time, and a lot of times we think, like I said in the last example, we can evaluate a lot of people's contributions and a lot of projects by their success and failure, right? So if a project is successful, what does that mean? It means that you're successful at doing something, meeting your objective, and that's good. But a lot of times, you only partially try, or it's a very ambiguous thing. It's just really hard to know. Especially if you're working on a project like something where you're trying to discover anything, or you're trying to, find, like in statistics, you're trying to look for, machine learning and things like that. You're trying to find insights. Well, you might not find the insights that you would hope, but you might find some limited insights that are interesting. So we have to think about, ambiguous successes, how we assign time. And it's important to think about time at different time scales. And I have this graph to show you kind of how, there are different ways of conceiving time. So this is the cosmic calendar. So on the cosmic calendar, we can go all the way back to the Big Bang. But we can represent all time since then as like kind of a year-long period. All right, so if the Big Bang was on 12:01 a.m. on January 1st, and we go through time, and we get to humans, or our moment right now, we're at December 31st of the year at 11:59 p.m. We can see that we're just kind of a sliver of this timeline. And in fact, most of human history is like, I don't know, in the last 40 or 50 minutes of the last day of the year. So it's just, or actually 40, 50 seconds, last minute. So that's really, really a small period of time that we've been around as humans. Now, the thing is that like you can think of a project in this way too. You can think of project as being sort of part of a larger discipline or a larger enterprise. The enterprise computing or the enterprise whatever. And you can think about the project as being a very small part of it. So it helps you think about the scope here. You don't want to achieve everything because when you think about like the history of computing, people have generally achieved, or they generally tackle projects that are very small units of thing, and you can't like solve like grand computing problems in a month. It's just not going to happen. So you have to think about things in terms of this cosmic calendar, where your project fits into the scheme. The other thing to think about, especially when you think about contributors to your project, your community, is that we all have lifespans. And so this is a graph of lifespans from birth. So this is each of these circles represents a month. And we start off, of course, in month one with their birth. And this chart ends when someone turns 90. So it's a pretty long lifespan. And so you can think about like people's lifespan as a series of months. And if you're engaging in a project that's 6 months long, you're occupying 6 of these circles in someone's life. In fact, every person in your team, you're occupying 6 of those circles. So, if you think about it that way, it's a pretty good time investment. It might not seem like a lot, but that's what you're doing. You're basically taking that time away from that person's life. And I know it sounds kind of depressing, but basically, so what you're doing is you're occupying that time. But also people are in different periods of their life. So sometimes people are, around 20 to 30 years old and they're doing things in this period. Sometimes people are older. In open source communities, you can have people who are very old, very young, and maybe in between. And they all have things going on in these circles, families, school, and they might be retired, but they still have, things that they do. So you have to think about this sort of way that people's lives, you have to think about how much time you're occupying with a project, what's going on. Not every contributor is going to be encountering the same things. But that 6 months, some people might be in different phases of their life and so forth. So when you think about time in a project, those are 2 good ways to think about them. To keep things in perspective, to keep those successes in perspective. You don't want to bite off too much. And if you have very limited successes, that's okay. It's not like worth getting upset about. You can just have another project to see some of these things through. But you don't want to spend too much time on any one sort of trivial thing. So that's a little bit of word about time, success, valuing. So another thing to think about, especially in terms of community building, in terms of managing institutional knowledge, and how you can have points of failure in organization, is think about sort of how things are controlled. And this could be in the main in the core organization. It could be in the community. It could be both. But there's this issue of like how people, how you cultivate leaders, how you maintain good leaders, how you prevent them from burning out and leaving the organization, taking on institutional knowledge. So that's kind of what one concern that I've seen in a number of organizations. And one of the points here is that top-down control can be a problem. So a lot of people think that to run a good organization, run a good project, you need to have someone who's sort of benevolent, who just basically tells everyone what to do and then manages everything. And then everything will be fine and everything will be smooth. And indeed, you can have people like that and it can work, but you always run the risk of 2 things. The first is that they get tired of it before that comfort. And that's a problem that not everyone, I mean, could be that they have, again, with their life, their lifespan, they're occupying these circles in life. Sometimes they have personal issues, or sometimes they want to do something else. There are all these conflicts that come into play. So you don't want to rely on one person to manage things. But more importantly, you don't want one person to have all the institutional knowledge. If you have a benevolent dictator type model, they likely have a lot of the institutional knowledge that you need. And that could be, anything from kind of the decision making we were talking about in the first week of class, to some of the other, things like, maybe they know all the passwords or something, if it's a very small project. And you don't want to run the risk of them leaving and not being available to deal with that. So what we're talking about at a larger scale is this idea of a single point of failure. And so if you want to have a good, robust project, you need to have multiple failure. Not meaning that you want to have a lot of failure, but that if one person gets ill, if one person burns out, especially if they're leaders, that you can go to someone else, you can go to a set of resources, and everything will be all right. You can recover a lot of that. You don't have to worry about a person. You don't have to rely on them too much, and your project doesn't go down the drain because you lost that one person who knew everything and did everything. So this means that we need to cultivate new leaders. We need to cultivate potential new leaders. Sometimes that's why a community is important. You can bring people in who maybe have leadership skills, bring them up to speed in the organization, and if we lose people, we can recruit those people to come in and take over in the project. Sometimes, we want to take things out of people's heads, put them into documentation, or put them into some body of knowledge that everyone can access. So if we have these potential leaders, they can access the information. Anyone can access the information that's needed, institutional information, administrative information, etc. It's also important to do that because when people leave things in their heads, they tend to forget things anyways. So even if they don't know, it can be a problem to sort of have good standards and recognize. And again, we worry about burnout, we worry about turnover in leadership because managing everything can be overwhelming. So when you manage a project, it can be overwhelming, and you have, like I said, you occupy those circles within your lifetime. Sometimes those, you don't want to occupy too many of those circles with a lot of administrative tasks or whatever. So people tend not to want to, manage everything. So you need to have people who can take over. You need to have people maybe train multiple people to manage different parts of the organization. So that's an important thing to do to work, to kind of safeguard yourself. Another thing about organizations and their associated communities is that key functions should not depend upon one person. You should aim to distribute authority and institutional. And so again, this has to do with, especially with expertise. You don't want to rely on one person for expertise in a certain area because if that person leaves, they get burnt out, they get a better job offer, you lose out and you don't have the ability to recover. So again, this is where if you have people in the community who have the skills and you have the information all, kind of in a body of knowledge, you can kind of avoid this problem. You don't have to rely on one person. You don't lose things that you need. So this means that when you have tasks that are done, you want to document how. You want to have, certain permissions for those documents. You want to have dependencies for those documents, and you want to understand what those are. Sometimes it makes sense to have co-managers as project leaders, where you have sub-projects where you have leaders, where you have co-managers who kind of manage the task equitably and things like that. And then, of course, you want to grow your leadership through apprenticeships or through your open source community, where you can, have people coming into who are interested in the project, who may not be directly a part of the project. You want to be able to give them the information they need. They can eventually take leadership of things, maybe in an open source community context, and then perhaps join the team if required or if necessary to, to make sure that you have expertise. All right, so remember our slides on social capital from you. We talked about trust. And when we talked about trust, we said that each contributor will abide by the expectations of the people. We talked about building a social contract between people in the community, potential contributors, and the core contributors, sometimes the leaders. Or sometimes you're building trust between each other. So if you're working in an open source community, collaborating with people halfway around the world, you have to build trust because it doesn't come natural. And that's sort of the glue of like a lot of your community and your project as a whole, is to have this buy-in from people working together. So if you propose changes to a project, propose that something is important, people have to agree, or else it doesn't really happen. If I tell you, I'm a benevolent dictator, I tell you, we're going to do these things, they're important, and then if it turns out that I'm wrong, then people lose interest, they lose trust and they'll lose interest. So you want to have this sort of, you want to maintain this buy-in from the community. You want to be able to maintain this buy-in within your organization, and you want to be able to build this social contract between the people who are sort of the managers or the leaders and the people with different problems. You also have altruism and innovation. Altruism being a system of mutual support, where cooperation is general in favor of competition, but where competition may be used in favor of the greater good. So there's this aspect of altruism that goes into leadership, where we sort of give something back to the community. Usually, it's giving people in the community an opportunity to learn something. Sometimes it's giving people in the community an opportunity to join the main organization, the main development team, say, for example. Sometimes we have different types, we tend to cooperate with respect to our interests. So if we're, doing like a bug reporting system, we implement a bug reporting system. We say, I'm going to release this beta version of the software, and people can use it and report bugs. That's actually an act of altruism because you're helping the project, you're helping the greater good. It's not just that I'm fixing my own bug, I am helping fix a bug for the entire community. And so that's something that, a lot of times when you build a community around a project, you can have that sort of altruistic support that actually helps the project and helps people involved in the project, whether they be in the community or the core team. We also have innovation. And of course, again, innovation is where we want to develop new ways of doing things. We want to develop new techniques and technologies. But we also, in innovating, we want to encourage people to sort of, do innovation through this sort of open source community model. So one way we do this is that we can, give people access to, say, our code base. And we say, if you can find a way to build a new feature into the project, we'll accept it, and you'll be credited with it. It gives an opportunity for anyone to say, there's some good idea to pursue, I can pursue it. And if I find success and the quality is good, then it gets incorporated in the project. So it drives innovation from the community. It helps people in the community think what would be good for them to see in the project, and it helps you sort of, gain things in the project software that you otherwise wouldn't have. So that's how we can drive innovation in these kind of open source communities and vis-a-vis our project. And then, of course, it's not just about innovating, creating new things. It's also a virtuous behavior that helps bootstrap additional. So if I enable innovation in my open source community, it's one person a success in creating a new feature. Like I said, we might give them a trial run and say, okay, well, why don't you pursue this feature? If it works, then we'll accept it and we'll give you credit. And we might advertise that this person did a great job in creating this feature. And it serves as a model for other people. So our project benefits from having a new feature. They benefit from creating something, and of course they can put that on the resume, and it might lead to them getting a good job because they've been able to create something on their own. But then it encourages other people to do the same. And so we may see more people go down this route. We might establish a pipeline of new features from the community. People who can create new things from the template that we've given them, and they can gain some benefit. So you see all of these things come together by, you can leverage your open source community with the project that you're working on to make a better project, to make everyone benefits. There are also ways to reward and recognize individual contributions within the organization that doesn't have to do with open source contributions or innovation. So this is an article called The Manifesto for Rewarding and Recognizing Team Infrastructure. This is from Trial and Error, the journal. And they're interested in this study in large scale open. So they point out that a lot of these kind of large scale open projects feature teams of diverse backgrounds. So we talked about this where you have different groups of people with different skills, and you need to bring those together sometimes to build, especially if you're working on large scale software. So it's something like, at Microsoft, they Windows and front office, and they need a lot of different groups of people there with different skill sets to contribute to the project. And of course, they can't do everything simultaneously, so they can break up the work, they need schedule. So, but it doesn't need to be you need to have some sort of management. It's kind of a very large thing to charge. So sort of an organization. So, you're building this very complex piece of software. You have a bunch of different teams working on their own. It can't really be, you don't really want to have this benevolent dictator model where you're trying to micromanage everything. So how do you do this? And, we also have to keep people motivated because, sometimes when you're in teams and you don't get recognition, you get discouraged. So it's a delicate balance. In this article, they advocate for cultivating professional team infrastructures, TIRs, rather than individual accomplishments. So I talked about in the open source example, we have these individual roles for innovation. I take on the task of creating a new feature for the software. I get the recognition, and other people might have a similar interest. They might get personal recognition. But when you have these teams, it's hard to do that because it's never really an individual effort. You always have the team is actually doing something together, so it's hard to really parse out who did what. And then two, you make other people on the team feel kind of left out. It's not the kind of principles that I mentioned in the past few slides don't really work when you have tightly integrated teams. So, rather than focusing on individual accomplishments, we can focus on team infrastructure. And that is, what are people contributing to? If a team does well, who did what in terms of the infrastructure? How can we transfer that to other teams? So it's a different way of looking at this problem, of motivating people, of getting people, building up a project and getting everyone to sort of benefit. Okay. I'll keep going and see how far. 10 minutes. So, sometimes we have to manage our community. We're talking again about an open source community. And so a lot of people, there are a lot of strategies for managing communities. Sometimes it's just a matter of onboarding people into some sort of organizational portal and saying you're a member of the team or you're a member of the open source community. Sometimes you need to have an infrastructure. It's a little detailed because people want to interact with each other. So a lot of smaller software projects will use Discord. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with Discord, maybe you're too many Discords, but a lot of people will use a Discord to organize what they're doing, to organize their community. So they'll have people join their community through a portal. We'll give them some onboarding material, say welcome to the community, and then put them into a Discord. We talked about Stable Diffusion, the generative AI platform. They manage their entire community in Discord, which isn't really recommended for like dealing with a lot of content. But Discord can be useful for a lot of community admin things. So if you're trying to get people educated about different topics in your organization, if you're trying to get people to talk to one another, Discord can be a nice tool if people oriented. But then you can have other resources as well. So this is one resource, your Discord channel. This is an example from Scilab, which is a scientific software or scientific computing software. They're open sourced, obviously. They have a number, they'll have this page here. This is actually off software. So there's like a community tab, and you go there, and this is basically what they tell you. So they have different links to places where you can go to join the community or contribute. So they actually tell you, okay, you can add and improve functions on GitLab. So GitLab is kind of like GitHub, it's a different platform. So your first option, if you want to join this community, is you can just go to their GitLab site or their repository. You can add or improve functions. There's no onboarding, you just kind of pick it up and contribute a piece. Sometimes people will write code that's custom code and they contribute directly. That's okay. That's one portal into the community. There are also help pages, so you can view help pages or edit them. So you can work on documentation and be a part of the community. You can say, I'm going to, I have a problem. I figured out how to do something and I want to write the documentation for it. So I'm going to contribute it through this portal. You can publish toolboxes on something like Atoms. So this is publish something to the community of users. And you can post questions on Discourse. We'll talk about what Discourse is. It's kind of like Discord. It's different in ways. So they have these different, they have this sort of discussion area. They have this repository. They have this other repository. And they have documentation. And that's how you become involved in the community. So you go from that sort of general public sphere, that outer shell of that three shell circle that I showed you before, that concentric circle. You come into that next inner circle of open source community by doing one of these things. And there are multiple ways to do it. And then I guess if you're good enough, you might actually join their core team for the project. But they don't give you a round to that. So, I talk about community onboarding. Oftentimes when you have an open source community, you need to have portals into that community. So, sometimes it's just a matter of giving someone a link. But you want to confirm that they're interested. You want to confirm that they, clicked on that link. A lot of community involvement is by confirming that people have done what they need to do. They're getting what they want. So there's this whole procedure called community onboarding, which is bringing people into your modes of interaction project. So if you have an open source community, you usually have different ways that you interact with people. And you want to start by onboarding them, giving them sort of a set of procedures and policies to get started. So they may join a Discord and there might be a thing that pops up, that gives you the terms of the community, maybe, a set of community standards, tells you where to go for things, etc. Then you might have surveys and frequently asked questions. So you might route people to frequently asked questions, which they might contribute to, or you might ask, provide a survey where they can say basically what they want out of their experience in the community. You can use chat bots for facilitating people and for question answering. So this doesn't need to be like, a staffed endeavor. This is done with automation, chat bots. You can automate the onboarding guide as well. You can send it out by email or put it embedded into something like a Discord intro page or something. You can, you can engage your team using Slack teams or Discord servers, so you just don't dump someone into the Discord Slack channel. You try to engage them in different ways. You try to structure the channels to be useful to them so that they can go and interact with people, pick up pieces of the project and work on them, or interact and find resources that they need. And then in a community, when we do all these things, we don't just do the ones that need. We'll often want to continually improve our community process. So when we have an open source community, we say, okay, we identify people who might be interested in interacting with their project. We onboard into the process. We give them tools that they can interact. And then, we see how that goes. If everyone's satisfied, find what they need, if people start contributing, people start discussing things, that's great. But sometimes people don't do that. Maybe your process is ineffective. Maybe the way you set these up are highly ineffective and nobody actually can get into the community or contribute in any way. So, and even if they do to some level, you always want to improve how you have people interacting with your project. So you'll have an open source community, have some, options for contribution, and you look at like how people are interacting. And you find that maybe people aren't using the Slack teams in Discord servers. So you might decide that you want to get rid of that and try something else. Try some other way to engage people in this open source. So you always want to introduce new tools and processes, but you also don't want to reinvent the wheel every 6 months. You want to have a community that's somewhat stable, but you want to perfect how people interact. Okay, so I'm going to stop here today. I'm going to pick up on this next time. Yeah, a few more slides. So we'll pick up on this next week. Any questions for today? Okay. Yeah, again, we'll continue on community building and things like that next time. Be sure to turn in your quiz 1. Next Wednesday, I'm going to be assigning the second reflection. So please, be on the lookout for that and complete your quiz 1 too. Have a good weekend.